Hello, and thank you for joining me. This is Hart Hagen from Louisville, Kentucky, and we're going to talk about climate change and especially what does the New York Times have to say about the effects of animal agriculture on climate change. So let's go to that window here. So this is from the New York Times. It is a summary, a kind of a let's put the cookies on the bottom shelf type of summary of what they want their people to know about climate change. Let me give you an overview first. I'm going to try to make this a little smaller. So, this is like have climate change questions? Get answers here. The New York Times Climate Desk. Climate change is tremendously complex, and we're here to help. The Climate Desk at the Times has been collecting reader questions and has started answering them here. So I decided to skip on down to something that I have some interest in, which is animal agriculture. It says, browse the questions below, the science. So let's go down here to where they're talking about how does ranching and animal agriculture affect climate change? So it says raising animals to feed people has a significant effect on climate change and the environment in general. And it's not just about belching cows. So where I'm coming from with this is that there is a mainstream climate change narrative that I do not embrace at all. Yes, climate change is real. Yes, fossil fuel usage is serious. Yes, fossil fuels emit carbon dioxide, but that's about as far as it goes. They want to bury the plain facts and the plain truth underneath just a few concepts. They're obsessing on a few concepts. We're going to obsess on carbon dioxide and ignore everything else. We're going to obsess on fossil fuels and ignore everything else. We're going to obsess on animal agriculture and ignore everything else. So that's where I'm coming from, and I'll share with you some of my concerns. So it says, cattle get a lot of attention because of their burps. The specialized digestive system of cattle and other ruminants, including sheep, produces methane that is released into the atmosphere, mostly through belching. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that digestion accounts for about 40% of the emissions from animal agriculture. So we're going to see throughout this that they're going to focus on emissions. So is emissions the only thing that causes climate change? I would say, when they talk about emissions, they're talking about greenhouse gases. And I would say that greenhouse gases, that refers to what we do to the atmosphere. It doesn't refer to what we've done to the land. I would argue that what we've done to the land is even more significant than what we've done to the atmosphere. When I say what we've done to the land, I'm talking about deforestation. I'm talking about agriculture, but not that all agriculture is bad, not that all farming is bad, but the way we do agriculture is fundamentally broken. And I think that agriculture is an example of land use, and land use, what we've done to the land, what we've done to the surface of the land has a great deal to do with climate, because what ecosystems occupy the surface of the land, and ecosystems have the potential to regulate our environment, to regulate temperatures and regulate precipitation. So let's read on and see what they have to say here. Well, what I was referring to there is that the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that digestion accounts for about 40% of the emissions from animal agriculture. So we're going to focus on emissions almost at the exclusion of everything else. When they talk about emissions, they're talking about the emission of carbon dioxide and methane And that's only part of a cycle. There are natural cycles that produce carbon dioxide. Every time we exhale, we're producing carbon dioxide. There are natural cycles that produce methane. And when we fart, we produce methane. When cattle belch, they produce methane. When bacteria have to digest something in an anaerobic environment, they're producing methane. So these are natural cycles, and we need to look at the whole cycle. We need to look at the cycles that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and not just look at the cycles that emit carbon dioxide. So when it says digestion accounts for 40% of the emissions from animal agriculture, I'm like falling asleep, because so what? But reading on. However, a wide range of other emissions are related to the production of feed. See, they're talking about emissions. We're going to talk about emissions, and then we're going to talk about emissions. And then we get done with that, we're going to talk about emissions. So a wide range of other emissions are related to the production of animal feed, animal transportation, and other activities. So animal transportation relates to roads. Roads have to do with land use changes, or the destruction of land to do what we do. But we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the other impacts of animal agriculture. We're only going to talk about emissions. And if you talk about it long enough, and if you sound authoritative enough, then you must be smart, and you must be telling the truth if you talk about it long enough and you sound authoritative enough. And besides, this is what the cool kids are talking about. But the cool kids are not talking about land use changes. They're not talking about how much land is taken up, not just by agriculture, but by other things that we do. So it says overall, the UN agency, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the UN agency estimates that globally, the raising of livestock of all kinds is responsible for nearly 15% of all emissions related to human activity. So we're only going to talk about emissions. That's one thing that's for sure. We're only going to talk about emissions, with rare exceptions. And if we talk about emissions enough, then we'll make everybody think that that's what the smart people are talking about, and that's what the cool kids are talking about. So you have to be up on emissions, and are you buying this or that thing that is supposed to lower your emissions? Next sentence says, cattle raised for meat and milk account for about 2/3 of total emissions. Okay, emissions. Okay, wake up. Emissions. And pig production accounts for about 10%. Buffalo, chicken for meat and eggs, and other animals like sheep account for smaller amounts. So when I hear pork and chicken, I think animal welfare. So we're going to talk about emissions all the time, baby, and we're not going to talk about animal welfare. We're not. So briefly, what I'm talking about there is that cattle live a better life than pigs or chickens in our current industrial agricultural system. So I care when I eat when I eat the meat from an animal, I care whether that animal had a good life or not. And so it's not like I never eat chicken, because I do. It's not, my diet could use some positive changes, but I feel much better eating beef, because I don't think beef are abused and tortured nearly as much as pigs and chickens. So, but we're not going to talk about any of that. We're just going to talk about the emissions. In fact, one person made the argument that, well, chicken and pork emit less emit less carbon dioxide in the process and the whole life cycle. So it's better to switch over to pork and chicken. So I'm like, yeah, in these torture factories that we have for pigs and chickens. Moving along, when measured by a unit of protein produced, beef has by far the largest carbon footprint. So there we are. We're only going to talk about the carbon footprint with rare exceptions. The production and processing of animal feed, forage crops like hay, as well as corn and other grains, accounts for even more emissions than digestion. So now we're getting into it. Now we're talking about the thing that really matters when it comes to animal agriculture, and that is, where do we get the feed, and how is that grain and soybean raised to feed the animals? And so when I think of corn and soy and wheat, I'm thinking of the worst elements of modern agriculture, almost bar none. Because, if you want to know how we're treating the earth, look at how we're treating the soil. And when we raise corn and soy and wheat for animal feed and hay for animal feed, we're treating the soil very badly. At this point, it would be great to get into Gabe Brown's book, The Principles, or the Dirt to Soil, the 5 principles of soil health. We don't have much time to get into that, but the way we grow grains for animal feed destroys the soil. It destroys the soil so that the soil is very kind of destroyed when it comes to the capacity of the soil to grow good food, the capacity of the soil to filter our water, the capacity of the soil to make the plants resilient, because good soil makes plants resilient. Good soil delivers nutrients to the plant, and that those nutrients are, make the plant resilient and make the plant nutritious. So throw all of those principles of soil health out the window to raise grains the way we raise grains, corn and soy. Soy is not a grain, but same idea. It's a monoculture. And so if you want to look at the impact of plant-based agriculture, including the plants that we feed to the animals, if you want to look at the impact of plant-based agriculture, you have to look at how we grow grains. The way we grow grains and beans is to destroy the soil. We use lots of fertilizers. We use lots of chemical pesticides such as herbicides. In fact, genetically modified corn and soy is genetically modified so that it's resistant to herbicides like glyphosate. And that's what we're doing that's destroying the farmland. It's not the mere fact that we're raising animals. It's more the way that we grow grains and plants and beans is destructive of the soil. It's destructive of the water because it destroys the capacity of the soil to absorb rainfall and filter out water. The way we do corn and soy and wheat, it causes erosion. And erosion, not only, when erosion happens, you're losing the soil. And when erosion happens, the dirt, the soil is just floating downstream. So that's the way we do industrial agriculture. It's not whether we're growing animals or plants, it's whether we're doing it in a way that is destructive on the industrial model or regenerative. The word regenerative simply refers to a process a type, an approach, a method of growing things that tends to restore the soil. Well, the soil, but also the ecosystems and the water. So we can regenerate our water cycles, or we can continue to destroy them. We can regenerate our soil, bring life back to the soil, or we can continue to destroy it. We can raise our animals and our crops in a way that is good for the surrounding ecosystems, or we can continue to destroy the surrounding ecosystems. It's not whether you're growing animals or plants. It's whether you're regenerating the soil, the water cycles, and the ecosystems or not. So it says here, the production and processing of animal feed, forage crops like hay, as well as corn and other grains, accounts for even more emissions than digestion. So see all the stuff I just talked about, the water cycles, the soil, production of healthy food, the water quality of the waterways, the streams and rivers and the oceans, and the capacity of an area, including a farm, to provide wildlife habitat. All those things, we have forgotten how to talk about any of those things because we're obsessed on emissions. It is sick and it is dysfunctional how we're obsessed on talking about emissions. And I think we're being taken to the cleaners, and there's another metaphor that's better than that. We're being misled. We're being led down the garden path by this obsession with emissions. But that's all they're talking about. What's wrong with farming and ranching in the world today? Well, emissions. And we're going to talk about emissions. We're going to talk about how much this or that thing produces emissions, and how cows burp and that creates emissions. And we're going to talk about how they really don't talk about the emissions created. They don't talk very much. I mean, they are here. They don't talk very much. They don't talk in a way that is intelligent or holistic or analytical when it comes to the emissions that are created by the crops that we use to feed the animals. Let's go on. Some of these emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels to run agricultural equipment and heat or cool barns and other facilities. Okay, yeah, I'm saying yeah. They talk about electrification, and they talk about solar and wind and how that's going to lower our carbon footprint. I really don't buy most of that. But what they almost never do is talk about the opportunities for reforming our agriculture system in a way that's good for the farmer, good for the consumer, good for the animals, good for our waterways, good for our soil. And oh, by the way, it reduces emissions. Or maybe it doesn't strictly reduce emissions, but it absorbs more of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's what we want to do. We want to look at these things holistically. We want to look at the whole system. We don't want to obsess on one little part of the system as if that is everything. I tell you, environmentalism has been seriously dumbed down. And environmentalism is like, let's give people a lobotomy first and then go from there. So, next paragraph, an analysis by Our World in Data, a scientific publication affiliated with the University of Oxford, found that agricultural land could be reduced by 75% to 1 billion hectares from 4 billion. So I haven't read this study yet. I'm going to read this study. and I'm going to get back with you on this study. But what I think I'm going to find is that they're not looking. I will eat my shirt if you can raise animal protein, if it takes more land to raise animal protein than it does to raise protein in the form of soy and corn and wheat. But here's what. How much land are we taking? How much land are we using? But how much land are we, the land that we use for animal agriculture could be drawing carbon out of the air and restoring our water cycles. That's what they're not talking about here. But I'm going to get back with you on that. It says here, when a rancher or beef producer clears a forest to create grazing land, large amounts of carbon in the felled trees is released. Okay, fine. The thing is, we don't have to cut down trees to grow our livestock. We could be growing our livestock on the deserts of the world, because the deserts of the world used to be grasslands. Most of the deserts of the world used to be grasslands. And the crime and the sin and the shame is that we are not using livestock to restore our, we're not using our livestock to restore our deserts. We could be using our livestock to restore our deserts. But what are our deserts doing now? Where a desert is a hot plate, typically. A desert is a hot plate. Deserts are heating up the land and heating up the air. We're not talking about that. We could be talking about taking the deserts of Arizona and Colorado and Texas and restoring them to the grasslands they once were. We're not talking about that. The urban environmental public is not being taught to think about these things at all. But livestock can be a tremendous force for restoration, especially the restoration of the grasslands of the world. And if we did that, there wouldn't be a need to cut down more forest to graze cattle. Besides, quite often when a forest is being cut down, it's being cut down for the timber, not for the grassland. I have a friend in Ecuador, Kristen Crash, who is restoring land that was deforested. Why was it deforested? Well, there are cattle grazing on this land, but they're poor cattle and they're not doing very well. But the land was cut down for the timber. From an economic standpoint, it's the timber that they wanted. It's not the grazing land, because it makes for bad grasslands, because it's a tropical forest and it's not made to grow grass. It's made to grow trees. But so when you hear reports of forests being cut down to grow for grazing for cattle, I think many of those reports are false, because they're not really looking at what are the facts on the ground. What is the real reason that forest was cut down? Besides, we wouldn't need to do any of that if we were taking if we were taking the deserts of the world and using cattle and sheep to restore those deserts. 300 years ago, 400 years ago, the American West was not the desert that it is now. And it's a desert now because it has not had enough animal impact. So this has been a review of what the New York Times has to say about animal agriculture and livestock. It has also been kind of a review of where are we in the climate conversation? Is the climate conversation as per the New York Times, as per the United Nations? Is that climate conversation leading us in the right direction, or is it leading us in absolutely the wrong direction? I submit to you that the climate conversation is absolutely leading us in the wrong direction. And I hope you'll come back very soon so we can talk about it some more. This is Hart Hagen signing off. I hope you have a great day.